Hi, and welcome to the Seamless Blend, digital textile dialogues with Gabby and Jorgen. Our primary purpose is to educate and initiate discussions. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not constitute professional advice or services. We invite contributions from our audience and maintain an open community on Discord. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Welcome to a new episode. This week we're gonna do something a little bit differently. In this particular season, or now after the summer, we've been doing these shorter episodes where we've been trying to kind of stick within a time frame of about 20 minutes of what we're talking about. So we keep things a little bit shorter, and also breaking things up a little bit more. In today's episode, we've kind of had this big topic that we've been going back and forth and discussing quite a lot, and we thought it would be worthwhile to do a bit of a deep dive into this. So if you're listening to this and you're in a rush or you want to prepare yourself for a slightly longer episode, today might be slightly longer. So I think maybe just even to begin with briefly, we usually start the episodes by telling you a little bit more about who we are and what we do, and in particular today in today's discussion we're going to talk more about a supplier-led DPC model, which is a bit of a hypothesis or what could be a potential future for DPC. And before we go into that discussion, I think it's important to just briefly talk a little bit about what we've done before, both for myself and for Gabby. And I can start by just mentioning that I spent 10 years in Hong Kong working mainly with China and garment and fabric mills in all around Asia. And I really got to see one of the things that actually got me into the textiles industry to begin with was I think just the first realization, or two realizations that I had. One was how much was happening behind the world of fashion, and suddenly getting to see what manufacturing looked like at a big scale, or in a real scale, that the products that you see in a store don't just kind of end up in a store magically. There's actually a lot of work that goes into it. And so getting to see a fabric mill and a garment factory for the first time was quite mind-blowing. And also to understand a little bit more of the interaction between retail brands and manufacturers, and to see this kind of dynamics and the way that these companies are working together, both retail to supplier or supply chain, as you can say, but also very much how suppliers are working together, or you could maybe more specifically how we go from fiber to yarn to fabric to garment, and all the small processes in there. And that's, I think, also important to it's going to be important to discuss both of those sides and both of those perspectives in today's discussion. So that's a bit about my background. And what about you, Gabby?
Yes. So, well, I've basically worked on the supply side of manufacturing since 2001.
Mm,
Quite a long time, really. And
yeah.
I've not, so I have worked in the like for the UK audience, a supplier is that sort of like that middle person that works with the manufacturer. So I was actually working for a supplier that sort of harnessed and worked with the manufacturers, whether it's the textile mills or the garment manufacturers.
Mm,
From based in the UK, I worked for a big Chinese manufacturer called Esquel, and then I
mm,
worked for a big UK supplier called Dewhurst, where we had joint ventures with garment manufacturers, and then we had really close relationships with other garment manufacturers and also textile mills globally in lots of different
mm,
countries. So that could have been,
mm,
well, it was Indonesia, China, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, Morocco, and
mm,
onwards of Kenya, as it sort of moved around the globe. So I've got
mm,
a really strong knowledge within the supply side of definitely being in between the brand and the garment manufacturer. So I'm coming at it from that. And then I've also worked
mm,
really closely with textile mills for the last 10 years, like really, very, very, very closely with textile mills in Bangladesh for the last 10 years. So that's what I'm
mm.
bringing to today's session. And
Yeah.
it's definitely an area that's really close to my heart. We've been having these discussions in the background, and we thought it was really pertinent that sort of we could actually have this discussion today. And I think both of our perspectives are quite interesting because neither of us are embedded in a garment
Mm,
manufacturer or a supplier,
mm,
which means we have a bit more agency to talk. We can speak a bit more freely, I would say, because we're not
mm,
relying on those contracts going forward. So hopefully our speculations and our discussions today can all be taken with that in mind, that we're not sat in suppliers or garment manufacturers, which I think is really
mm,
important. And also, neither are we sat in brands or retailers. So we
Mm.
can look at those we can be a critical friend within that space, and we can sort of really like look at how those relationships have been built and how they work. And we're not here
Mm.
to sort of point fingers. We're not here to point blame. We really see this session as, and this deep dive as a speculation really
Mm.
around, with our kind of like deep knowledge within this space, what we know about DPC, what we know about suppliers, what we know about brands, and what we know about their relationships as well.
Mm. I think that was very well summarized. So essentially, we have been working in between these companies for many years already, and I think that also what and we're still doing this. So I think we have a relatively both let's say up to date and historical perspective
Yeah.
of what's actually happening and how the relationships are. So we're going to try to build a little bit more on that. And before we go into, I think specifically, like we mentioned, the supplier led concept, which we of course have to explain a bit more of what that means. But we're also building this off of the last episode where we talked a little bit more about this, like the current state of DPC and where are we right now with digital product creation for fashion and what's actually happening. And I think it's fair to say that most of us, as far as I know, and I've been speaking to people, it very much feels like DPC has fallen fairly well down on the list of priorities, or a lot of companies are deprioritizing DPC, or there seems to be a bit of a shift, and not necessarily intending to say that it's because DPC is not important or because we're afraid it's going to completely die out. It's mainly just because there are other things that are also quite important, both for brands and manufacturers, which are kind of elements like the economical environment or the global world that we live in and what's happening in that world. Other technologies like, for example, artificial intelligence and how that is coming in and impacting and taking more of the attention maybe away from DPC and a bit of that hype of DPC that we've gone through and everyone getting excited, and then another technology coming into it, and then maybe we lost a bit of focus on what some of the original promises and objectives of DPC was to begin with. So this is kind of building on this idea that DPC has sunken a bit far down at the moment, that if you look at it almost like a bit of a hype curve, or like we've really gone up in the
Yeah.
past few years with COVID being a big driver and coming kind of more out of COVID, DPC still maintained a really good momentum. And then now, let's say a good year to 2 years since COVID has kind of started slowing down, we've seen that DPC has come down with that. And so therefore also it's important to look at that. Just because it means that DPC has kind of lost a bit of the focus, then what kind of opportunities do we see with that? And that's what we want to talk about today also, is what is the opportunity, or what could companies do in this moment, even though many may say that DPC has kind of fallen a little bit in priority.
I think it's really important, and I think, as I said, it's as we can do it from the perspective of sitting in the DPC world, both of us looking at material digitization day in
Mm,
and day out. So we understand the complexities, the needs, and the challenges around that. And then also having our background of working either with suppliers, in suppliers, looking at the full system, looking at the full workflow, and also really looking at it in a realistic way and not a utopian vision of what
mm,
supplier-led DPC could be. And this is what we discussed about before we started the session today, which is
yeah,
actually we're trying not to be utopian about it. We're trying to be quite realistic and
yeah.
hopefully not too harsh, but actually quite realistic with it. Challenges
Mm.
and opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. This is not something that's like, it can feel almost, I think if we talk about it in a certain way, it can feel a bit utopian, but really with the way that we're coming at this, where the reason why we're talking about it in the first place is because we want to hear all the objections or kind of criticism of this idea. We want to put it out there so that we can try to tackle the practical challenges. And we're aware, and we've talked a lot about this, and we're discussing this ongoingly on what the practical challenges and the barriers are to actually doing this. So we have a pretty solid foundation, but we're going to talk a little bit more about also, I think, what that means in practice, and maybe even starting with, like we've called the episode, deep dive into supplier-led DPC, and what does that mean to you, Gabby?
Well, it's looking, first of all, let's define the supplier, because
Yeah,
actually we could mean a couple of different people
exactly.
in
Good
this
point.
at this moment in
Mm,
time. So we will look at it from a couple of different ways. We've got the supplier, which is the company that is that middle company between the garment manufacturer and the brand. We've got the supplier, which is the garment manufacturer, which really holds a lot of the technical information. So
mm,
when we want to look at where that works for the garment manufacturer, where holding DPC works for the garment manufacturer. And then we've also got, because we're not forgetting them, we've also got the textile mills who will be delivering some of that information in. But when we're thinking directly about the supplier today, we really want to consider the garment manufacturer who
Exactly.
is producing the samples and then the production for the brands and the retailers. So we've got suppliers who are the middle people, but let's focus really, really on the garment manufacturer who holds the technical knowledge for production and also makes the samples
Yes.
physically at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. No, I think exactly this. I think it's very important. The garment factory, and maybe even in that case, to define it even more, is that element for the maybe for those who don't know also that this is that the cut and sew element of like imagine here a factory, the textile fabric mill being the one that outputs a textile fabric, let's say a woven fabric that comes on a roll, arrives at a garment factory, is being laid out on a table and then being cut according to the patterns that the garment is going to be made of, and then so that's the cut part, and then the sewing part is then you sew the garment together. And then the interaction between retail brands and garment factories are then very often that there's this kind of dance back and forth of designing and developing and manufacturing the end product. And I think those three concepts are also quite important to highlight here, that the process of bringing a new product to market, and this is not a standardized process, so I can almost, like I have my way of looking at it and it might be a bit simplified and a lot of other companies might do it differently, but at least for me I like to divide it into that you have the design of the product, which is then more about kind of conceptualizing an idea and being able to communicate this idea and think about the functionality of the idea and the trend and the market and everything that's happening out there. And then we have this development aspect, which is more the technical engineering part, as I like to think of it, which is then making sure that the design can actually be produced and can be made, that you got to lay things out in different patterns and in different pattern pieces. You know, to do costing, and you have to think about how you're going to make not just one piece, but also how you might make, you have to make 10,000, let's say, these things. That's very much where you then go from development and over into production and mass production. And of course, in the production, you have to think about how you then produce consistently, let's say, the amount of pieces that you eventually want to, let's say 10,000 garment pieces or 5,000 garment pieces or whatever the amount would be. You have to then consider what does it then take to make those products consistently in those volumes.
Yeah, and actually, just to add to this, so we're talking about
Mm,
obviously the designer in the brands doing the design and development of the first piece that is made in that collection, which will be called the sample for what we're talking
mm,
about here. And actually, we need to note, so how do designers do that? A lot of the time right now, we know that designers will have a flat sketch, the beginnings of their tech pack. Then
mm,
they will have some extra sketching they'll have done around it, possibly some photographs and references from shop reports or other garments they've got as secondary sources. And then that sketch and tech pack will be sent to the factory,
mm.
obviously electronically, sent to the factory, and the factory will then make the sample. So if we're talking about supplier-led DPC, I think it's
Mm,
really interesting to think, when does that 3D work come in? Because
mm,
the designer still has to communicate their vision to the factory. And if
mm.
we're saying you're communicating it in a flat way through using Illustrator, we talk a lot about Adobe here, using
Yeah.
Illustrator with photographs, it's quite an inefficient way of communicating that information. Like
Mm,
communicating what you want with flat sketching is quite an inefficient way. You have to
yeah.
build up a good couple of years of relationships to work really well with your garment manufacturer. So
Mm, mm,
I
mm.
think when we're talking about this model, are we saying, and I'm asking this as a question, are we saying
Yeah.
that the garment manufacturers should then return that flat sketch in a 3D garment and say, this is the 3D garment that you've asked us to make, rather than making it
Mm,
physical? Or should the designers in the brands, in the head offices, start communicating their ideas in 3D to the garment manufacturer so that the garment manufacturer has a better idea how to make the sample? There's a
mm,
tension there.
mm.
When we've
Yeah.
spoken about this, we believe that the 3D design element and the 3D development element should be held within the supplier. So then we need to
Mm,
consider, how does the designer communicate their information across in a
yeah.
clear enough way that the supplier is ready to make a 3D sample?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And I think even almost like looking at the almost like the short-term history of DPC, even since, let's say, 2020, and how a lot of brands have embraced DPC so far, has been this. It's been an interesting relationship between how garment vendors or fabric mills or retail brands or how everyone has almost like been thinking about DPC in the process and where they all fit in. And I think so far, because of the kind of the power balance in the fashion industry in general, a lot of the decisions are being made by, or at least kind of with the current state of the power balance in these things, is that the brands have to very much lead. Like the retail brands and the designer have to make certain decisions and lead things forward. And then the assumption is a bit more that the garment vendors are going to listen to what the brands want, and then they're going to follow and do what the brands want, which makes sense. Like the garment factories' customers are the brands, and if the brands need something, then the garment factories will then adjust their business around what their customers' needs are. And I think what we've seen there is very much also this idea of how retail brands have certain limitations around DPC that makes it a bit difficult also to like, now that we have been pushing DPC, let's say in the timeline since 2020, very much like, it's hard to say that it's really been brand led, but I would almost like, I'd argue to say that it's been the brands leading, or at least like making the bigger decisions and saying like, you guys got to do 3D. But there are also, I want to highlight in that there are also lots of garment manufacturers and fabric mills that have proactively tried to do something in DPC and set themselves up for success. I don't know if you have any example of that earlier. Yeah.
I mean, 100%. Like, so if I take it from the brand side, we're not going to name any brands in this episode, because I think we need to keep confidentiality and respect the information and our conversations that we've had up until this episode. So I have worked with some brands which have actively delivered requests to their supply base, to their garment manufacturers, and said, we need X much percent in 3D this season. And they're actually their KPIs with their manufacturers they're asking them to hit 3D sampling as one of their key KPIs. And then they're also saying, and I've heard sort of like some rumblings around that, if some manufacturers don't start delivering 3D samples, they will be slowly removed from the supplier list, right? That's what people are saying. Whether it's actually happened, I don't know. But I do know that brands have sort of said, we are moving towards 3D. We need to see your 3D capabilities, and you need to start delivering in 3D. So therefore, there has been a request, there's been an ask, and the suppliers have had to deliver on that. And you could question, have the suppliers had any choice about that? Where have they been able to say, well, actually, no, or you know what, we actually use browseware, not Clo, for example. There are those kind of conversations that happen. Then if we're looking at the garment manufacturer side, the majority of the garment manufacturers that I speak with, the large garment manufacturers that I speak with, with sort of 20 plus clients, they have both Clo and browseware, because they're delivering in to different brands that have different requirements. And that is quite challenging, because they're two different pieces of software with, and I know I'm trying to think. I think I've met one 3D designer who makes in both. There's probably much more out there than just one. But that is quite a big ask, I think, to say, well, actually, can you make these designs, for browseware for us, and these designs in Clo for us? Other 3D systems are available, obviously. So that becomes quite challenging. But the general story is that brands request 3D design samples, and suppliers have to deliver them. That is the hierarchy.
I think almost like that, like if we and I think we could talk, like feel free to anyone challenges on that, and I think we can talk about it. But I think almost like with that, let's have that serve as the argument for why also like DPC has been quite brand led so far, amongst others. But like we can see that it's been the brands kind of leading it and pushing it on, or like not pushing it necessarily in a negative way, but then essentially pushing manufacturers to say, you guys got to get up to speed, and you got to have the software that we need, and so forth. And I think in that there's also been there's been a few limitations that has been difficult, I think, with this coming from the brand side. And I think that is coming back to the question that you asked earlier, is that, when is the handover point in design from brand or from designer to garment factory? I think that's an important question. Almost like, when do you hand over the design, and in which format do you hand over the design?
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing there, some of the limitations we've found with this, and I think what's important to consider, in addition to when brands are trying to lead DPC, and now as we're discussing supplier-led DPC in this case, is that brands very often, in my experience and what I've found in general also, to be have limited technical knowledge of the engineering and development of process of the garment.
Yeah.
Varying cases, lots of brands have them, but I would say the majority of brands, in volume at least, doesn't seem to have a lot of the technical knowledge of then being able to kind of convert a design into a technical development, an accurate and an optimized technical development kind of project. And they also tend to lack insights or information or knowledge within the brand about the actual manufacturing processes themselves. So there's
Yeah.
a disconnect to the production. And if DPC is going to span across design, development, and production, you're then leaving these two elements of development and production very much as up to the manufacturer to begin with. And more because of the pressures in the economic environment and around the world, we're seeing that brands have then maybe less margin and less ability to acquire that talent and that knowledge, and therefore have to rely more on their suppliers for these kind of, like, let's call it back end support. So I
It's
think that comes back
yeah.
to the question of, like designer, almost, and then when do they hand that over? And it seems almost like that it needs to come to the first part of the handover. It seems natural that the handover from brand or designer to garment manufacturer would be somewhere in the design stage. And then it's almost like, then maybe even back to you, Gabby, almost like on, like what about that design stage, or where could that handover be, and in which format within the design stage do you think it should be?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, because I do believe that there should be some 3D in head office,
Yes,
because
I agree too.
it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, so you have an element of 3D within head office, which allows for that clearer communication of what you're looking for. But
Mm,
also don't
mm.
forget that quite often designers might send full garments out that they've sourced, secondhand garments, vintage garments that they might
Yeah.
source, which patterns are being made from. So at that
Mm,
point, you need the technical skills of the garment manufacturer to make that pattern for you. So you
mhm,
might not be able to make it in 3D in head office. So I think,
mm.
in the same way that we've seen almost like these illustrator tech packs build up, I would expect to see 3D being built that way. And it's almost like you have your templates, you have your models in 3D, and it could be that you work on those with the supplier. So you sort of
Mm.
have, like, this is our core range of,
Yeah.
because if we think about most ranges, right, it's 80% core, 20% newness. So your core range
Mm.
is made in 3D by your
Mhm.
supplier. That totally makes sense. Then you work on your
Mm.
newness, which is what you have to develop on in 3D in tandem, which is when collaborative 3D tools come into play,
Yeah.
because you've got your core bodies in 3D, you know what those look like. You can be putting design refreshes on those in 3D without too much heavy lifting, I think, without too much 3D learning on the head office side.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
then when you've got the newness, that's when it's going to be opening up. So, and I think, and that's much more where you're looking at sort of like working much more collaboratively, using, for example, something like Browseware's collaborative tools, or Clothes collaborative tools, or Style
Mm.
3D's collaborative tools, where you're all
Exactly.
looking at the
Yeah.
same design elements in front of each other. You just all happen to be doing it on the computer. You
Mm.
could say
Mm.
that you could sit and do it in Figma if you really wanted to. I'm not suggesting on a flat sketch. I'm not suggesting that that's what you do, but
Yeah.
it's all working on the same design together. So
Mm.
saying, actually, we're looking for a revere collar, and we're looking for this, this needs to be extended, and then
Yeah.
and then the manufacturer works on the 3D piece, and then the designer's bringing in the print or the pattern or the stitching that they're looking for, and then the garment
Mm.
manufacturer goes, great, that's a photograph, I can translate that into what that would look like in 3D. So you're
Mm.
using that as a collaborative workspace,
Yeah.
rather than, I am delivering you information via email in this PDF, and you're going to go away, and 4 weeks later, I'm going to get a physical sample back.
Yeah.
It's inefficient for communicating your idea. It's very,
Mm.
very resource heavy. It's time heavy. And usually,
Mm.
unless you've got great relationships with your suppliers, you're quite often missing quite a lot of those design elements.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think, depending on which area of your collection you're working on,
Mm.
you'll be
Mm.
using 3D in a slightly different way. but I don't see any way forward unless it's collaborative
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
working in a collaborative workspace. And you have to, and I think as designers would agree with that. I probably can't speak for all designers, but we
No, of
have
course
to be
not. Yeah.
feeding it. We have to be feeding into it all
Mm,
together
mm,
to get
mm,
to that
mm.
point.
Yeah, no, I think and I also completely agree with that. And even is highlighting that we're not talking about this because we say supplier-led DPC, that we're taking 3D out of the brands and out of the designer's workflow, because we see, at least I also see it in that same way, that designers will still, do a lot of that design work and that like preparing and getting inspiration and looking at the core line versus the newness and setting things up and doing everything that you need to manage to bring a new collection to market. And 3D is a very important part of that. But I think very often now designers can get quite overwhelmed also by how deeply technical am I supposed to go within 3D? Am I supposed to, be very, very deeply technical on everything that has to do with the almost like the tech pack export elements? Or maybe that the model could look more like that designers and retail brands could then have a more light version. For anyone that have used, some software have a light version and a more advanced
Yeah,
version. And maybe the brands and designers could have a lighter design version that would be more almost like creatively focused and would be a little bit more based around how we do like almost like collaborative development through leaving comments digitally and looking at even almost
yeah,
like costing. And
exactly.
you get some guidelines from head office that says, oh, this is too expensive, we need to do something here. And that's when, for example, both the designer and having the garment vendor involved in that process is then it's good for both to be able to bring their perspectives and their technical knowledge to it in terms of how do we make something cheaper, or how do we improve certain score test results or scores, or whatever kind of measurement you're doing. It's then good to have both sides involved in it, so that 3D and DPC becomes more of that collaboration platform between brands and garment manufacturers. But what we mean by, I think, supplier-led DPC is that the brands are still very, very involved in the process, maybe slightly more from a more lightweight kind of software platform that is just focused on what the designers need and how they collaborate. And then there's another side of the software that is a lot more technically oriented, and could maybe in the future also integrate more closely with production, so that you have kind of that side of DPC sitting with the garment vendor or the supplier in this case. And I think that's really, at least for me, like on a very high level, what at least I feel like I mean by supplier-led DPC, is that the supplier is the one leading it by sitting on the more kind of core heavy lifting sides of the software, and then the designers are kind of coming onto that or attaching themselves onto that platform with their product and their designs and kind of coming into it. And so that the DPC workflows and platforms from the supplier side is set up so that it's almost like a bit of a plug and play environment. Like, here are my ideas. Okay, let me plug those ideas into the platform. And then what do you guys think as, very knowledgeable and technical manufacturers and developers on that side?
Yeah. And I think
Mm.
the areas that one thing we need to recognize is that samples are very rarely 100% correct. If they are, that's,
Mm.
that's very rarely a sample. It becomes a press piece, right? Or a fit garment at that point.
Mm.
So samples are very rarely 100% correct. So we also should not expect 3D samples to be 100% correct, because
Definitely
it's
not.
an
Yeah, yeah.
iteration process. So we've got to remember that.
Mm.
Um, and also just thinking, I think around, I think how much time and effort does still have to be spent on this design process and this iteration
Mm. Mm.
process, and really working with your supply base
Yeah.
collaboratively, rather than, and this is slightly challenging for some brands, but rather than just using your garment manufacturers as a pick up and put down service, which
Mm. Mm.
because quite often sort of this like, power imbalance comes from being able to remove the orders at a certain point. So basically, quite
Mm.
often brands, I'm just speaking very freely here, quite often brands will
Yeah.
hedge their bets. They will cross cost, because
Yeah.
that's business, right? They'll cross cost with a number of different suppliers, and
Mm.
essentially it's because you can then say to one supplier, well, I have it for $3.50 here, or for here I have it for $3.30. What can you do to work it out in between? which
Mm.
which then
Mm.
can end up being quite onerous for the brands,
Yeah.
And then the supplier always constantly feels quite under threat because the business might be pulled away at a certain point. So we
Mm.
know that this is a business practice that happens within fashion, and I'm sure it happens
Yeah.
in lots of other industries too.
Yeah.
Not just trying to get down on fashion, but we know that that's a business practice that happens within our industry. And I think working in a more collaborative way,
Mm.
you that element and that side of it will have to fall away slightly, because actually if you're going to commit to
Mm.
reducing down your resources, you need to commit to
Mm.
increasing your collaborative work with your supply base. I think
Mm.
that's
Mm.
those
Mm.
two things have to go hand in hand. If you're going to
Yeah.
reduce down your resources, you have to commit to working more collaboratively with your supply base, and I truly believe that,
Mm.
which is a
Mm.
slightly
Mm.
different model from
No, but
the
I
way
think
some people work.
it summarizes the same, almost like, because I think my hypothesis around this, and I'm just putting that out there as like this is based on a lot of assumptions, and like what I think could be a model under this umbrella of like supplier-led EPC, is that it seems like we're moving in the direction, not to go into any specifics, but almost like that we're moving in the direction of a more complex and more fast-moving world, and like a more competitive world in general, because it's because of the internet, you could say. I could
Yeah,
sit where I'm
everything's
sitting
faster,
anywhere in the
right?
world,
Yeah.
and I could deliver services to someone anywhere in the world. And like, we're all almost like, competing with each other in many ways when it comes to business and services. Not to make that into a bad thing, but that's just the world we live in. And so as a retail brand, it's very difficult in order to almost like to build a strong retail brand. It seems likely that you're going to have to invest in trying to understand your market, which is the consumer market in most cases. So the retail brand have to really deeply understand the segment of customers that they're serving, and who they are, and what they need, and what they want, and what the trends that are influencing their decisions, and so forth. And that's very complex, and we're going to have a lot of great technology to do that, but that's very complex. And the margins and the competition over that same market segment, and bringing your product to that market segment, is likely to increase, or like you're gonna have to really hone in on your value proposition to that audience to make your retail business work. And in that process, it seems unlikely that the brand can also maintain a large back-end operation. I think we see this kind of out over my years in Hong Kong, that the
Completely.
sourcing offices are becoming less and less, or where the big offices that of a big retail brand has a big sourcing office, which is essentially that back end management, that there's maybe less and less margin to maintain those kind of, let's just call them
Yeah.
overhead expenses right
Yeah.
now, if you look at the core business of the retail brand. And that work, I think we saw this was very much accelerated through COVID, that a lot of the sourcing work, or the back end work on the brand, got shifted over to the garment vendor just naturally, because you couldn't
Yeah.
meet in person, you couldn't do all these things. So brands had to rely on the garment vendors and the suppliers to make more decisions, and to advise with their own expertise. And I think that's really where we're going, and why it feels likely that we're going in this direction of this kind of supplier-led model,
Mm.
is because as brands are finding it more and more difficult to compete, and to maintain this kind of technical expertise, it seems likely then that the manufacturers are going to have to step up and offer this. And the kind of the proposition here with the supplier-led model is that, why don't the garment vendor, I'm making it sound very simple, but why don't the garment vendors just almost like step up proactively and say, we know that the market is going in this direction. We are not just manufacturing companies that are, our inputs are fabrics, and our processes are cut and sew, and our outputs are garments. Like, we're not just a processing unit. We're also a business that's built around our customers. And when we're built around our customers, we offer services and value add to those customers. And it seems likely that a lot of that value add could be in DPC. So that DPC can both add value to the collaborative relationship and how manufacturers work with retailers and brands. And it can also hold the potential to reduce the cost of, as you pointed out earlier, just the immense cost and resources and everything else that goes into samples and then production.
Yeah, so to speak to that point, your
Mm.
question of like, why don't I know you weren't trying to
Yeah.
be like really simplistic. Why don't
Yeah.
suppliers just
I don't want to
do
come off in the wrong way. Yeah.
3D samples? But yeah, why? So why don't? And the question is, why don't they? So for example,
Mm.
we do have some figures around the industry which 30% of costs can go into of like manufacturing costs can go into sampling. Basically,
Exactly.
that can be. We know that
Yeah.
some of those figures have exist. So
Mm.
let's say for this
For the
exercise,
sake of the
30% of your
math.
costs go
Mm.
into sampling. Great. Let's say that you then want to start doing 3D sampling, which you then have to obviously pay for the software, pay for a member of staff or train that member of staff. So your cost is going up, right? So you've got
Mm.
30% sampling, you've had to pay for your you've had to pay to sort of like start your DPC
Yeah.
journey. So then you start reducing down your sampling. Brilliant.
Mm.
You're reducing down your sampling, you're reducing down your cost, but you've still got the cost of what you've done to invest in DPC.
Mm.
What the brand hears is that you're reducing down your sampling costs. Oh, that's
Exactly.
fantastic. And I have
Yeah.
actually had brands say, well, if garment manufacturers are reducing down their sampling costs because they're no longer sending me physical samples,
Yeah.
surely my costs should be going down. That's not helpful. And
No.
it's
No.
realistically not the reality either, because as those as you're adopting a new technology, you are going to have an on cost, you are going to have a resource cost that is going
Mm.
you have to invest in. So
Mm.
yes, you're
Mm. Mm.
reducing down your physical sampling cost, but you're going to be increasing on your 3D sampling cost. So
Yeah.
that's going to balance out somewhere. I obviously don't have all of the figures within a garment manufacturer of what that balance is, but that is
Mm.
going to balance out somewhere. But what we know isn't helpful is I have had garment manufacturers come to me and say, but if we reduce down the physical samples we deliver, we are
Mm.
being asked for price reductions from our customers, the
Yeah.
brands.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is worrying.
Mm. Mm.
Margins are fine already.
Yes. Yeah, this is not almost like easy for anybody. I think it's really important to highlight this that, like this, one of the big things we have to bring out when it comes to DPC is that it requires significant investment. Like you have to,
Yeah,
it's not just Clo, it's maybe Clo and Browseware, and then maybe it's also Style 3D on top, and also Optitex, or like so many software, and then also fabric digitization, and then also like not to even mention that was the upfront, like the hardware cost and software cost, but what about the people that you're going to need to have involved in all this? That's probably a
yeah.
hidden cost that a lot of people don't even consider, but that's really expensive. So of course, like you
And to
are maybe
retain them as well. Once they're
you have to
trained, to
retain them.
retain
Yeah.
them because they're really in
Mm.
demand in production countries as well. If you
Yes.
just
Yeah.
go on, if you literally go on Fiverr and look for 3D designers, there's so many
Yeah.
in Bangladesh. There's like, because
Yeah.
they're like, everyone's doing freelancing on the side, everyone's doing it. It's
Yeah.
a really in demand skill right now. So actually,
Mm.
people retention as well as training is a cost as well.
Yeah. 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 No, and I think this definitely requires more discussion than I think what we can cover today. There are lots of like I said earlier, why don't just the garment vendor start doing this, and I'll be the first one to almost like start listing out all the reasons for why they don't just do it also. So like I have lots of reasons for why. I think that is an important part. I think with the ongoing, as you said, almost like the ongoing dynamics and the way that brands and manufacturers are working together, there are lots of things that's going to come up, I think, around with this model of, let's say now, you could be the first one to also say, but aren't we just shifting the responsibility from the brands to the supplier? Isn't that real? Like you mentioned also with money itself, like, oh, you're reducing cost here on the actual, like we don't have to pay for samples anymore and so on and so forth. Shouldn't you then be reducing the price to me?
Yeah.
Which is essentially one objection or like one criticism of this idea. Another one would be responsibility shifting from brands to suppliers. Another one would be, of course, risking exploitation, kind of similar to what we talked about with cost and price. But in all of this, the power imbalance that we know is already existing within the industry, if we are now suggesting that we're going to move the responsibility over to the suppliers, that can also go a lot of wrong directions. Or like, what do you think with all the like about this is just some of the objections that we're going to have to think more about, and where this is an early idea so
Yeah.
far?
Yeah,
Mm.
and I think another point that had been mentioned as well is that for small suppliers that might be very product specific,
Mm.
or just could be starting out, or they could just be small suppliers. It can be a real challenge to then actually implement, I think, DPC in that
Oh yeah,
area.
yeah. Mm.
I think something I would like to mention is the suppliers that we've worked with.
Mm.
I know a lot of the ones that you've worked with, and I think you know a lot of the ones that I've worked with as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We should recognise the fact that we have been privileged enough to work with
Mm.
really high performing garment manufacturers as
Absolutely, yeah.
well, especially with yourself in Hong Kong and
Mm.
myself in Bangladesh,
Mm.
and China in particular. So again, there are garment manufacturers who really are cut, sew, and trim. That's it. That's what you're
Yeah.
getting. Don't be asking for anything more. That is totally a model which,
Mm.
and some of those garment manufacturers are just going to say, this is not for us. This is not
Yeah.
where we need to be. But if
Mm.
we're talking about the sort of like the global garment manufacturers that we've worked with, a lot of
Mm.
whom have started to um, adopt 3D design, that's where we can see it obviously playing out quite well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But these are huge manufacturers that are still beholden to the power imbalances. They
Mm.
still have
Mm.
orders held
Mm.
over them. Honestly,
Mm.
they do. So, you know, it's not an easy one to dissect at all. And I
No.
don't want to say that we're just pushing towards the brands and the retailers to say it's your job to fix that, you know, hierarchical relationship. But what we
Mm.
do hear about, we hear a lot. And when I say where do we hear this? In Instagram, LinkedIn, and in articles, we hear a lot
Mm.
from brands and retailers about how they're improving their supply side, about how they're working, about how they're reducing down their resources. We hear a huge amount about that because it gets pushed
Mm.
out from those
Mm.
brands and retailers. We hear a lot less from the garment manufacturers about the
Mm.
challenges that they have,
Yeah.
because if they speak up or put their neck out, they are essentially could be seen to be criticizing their customers, which they're not trying to do. They're just trying to talk about those challenges. So
Mm.
that's, I think, what we've
Mm.
tried to address a little bit today.
Yeah.
Um, not sort of like poke the bear, but be a bit more like, well, we understand within the supply side what some of those challenges are, and we
Yeah.
think they should be recognized, and then we think they should be aired as well, especially
Mm.
when talking
Mm.
about DPC, because this same conversation could be um, connected to reporting, carbon reporting. It could
Yeah.
be connected to impact
Mm.
reporting, all of and
Mm.
DPP as well. So
Yeah.
digital
Yeah.
products
Yeah.
passports. Sorry. So yeah, it's not a
No,
conversation
I
that's
think it's all
isolated to one
integrated.
area.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's all, you know, DPC, DPP, whatever, you know, like all these words and things. So like I think we have these boxes and these boxes that we have as concepts to discuss them. But I think in the end of the day, we're talking about the actual objectives of all this is trying to improve the way that things are happening. And but it made me think also, even as you said, and maybe we don't discuss this in a lot of detail, but it just almost like to be even a bit controversial with, or to put a question out there, maybe even just to you, Gabby, first, is if, like you said, also a lot of manufacturers are straight up cut and sew and trim and just take an order and deliver on that order and manufacture and go. Like they don't necessarily want to have or have no desire to offer 3D and services and their expertise, and, you know, like it's just not their business. But do you think almost that, does this then create more room for there being these kind of production integrated service companies again? Like almost like, you know, we've talked a lot. If you look historically, there's a lot of sourcing businesses that were connected
Yeah,
to manufacturing. Hong Kong were full of them back in the days. There's a few, you know, big companies left, but now does actually DPC create a little bit of
I
almost
think
like a
it's a
new
whole strain.
foundation?
Yeah,
Mm,
it's a new value add for them completely, and
yeah,
I'm actually really surprised that significant numbers of suppliers haven't jumped on it,
yeah,
because I
yeah,
think it actually, because they're under threat. Those suppliers, those middle companies that work
yeah,
between
yeah,
the manufacturers and the brands have been
mm,
significantly under threat for the last 15 years.
yeah,
Um, in a significant period of time when I was working with them as well, and I think that's an amazing value add for them. So
mm,
I think there's all to play for in that
yeah,
arena,
yeah.
100%.
And I think we should include that, maybe even it's for the time being, you know, I think this is an ongoing discussion, but in this supplier-led model, I feel like it is the garment vendor that has this opportunity. We want to make it positive. You know, like we talked about a lot of the downsides of this and a lot of things we have to be careful with in the relationship between retailers and manufacturers. But I think it makes sense also to kind of include the two almost like the two types of businesses, the two business models in under this, that they're, you know, one business model that could be really seriously considering DPC as an opportunity is the garment vendor or the garment manufacturer, where those that are integrated within the production and naturally hold the technical skills of how you kind of bring an idea into production. That's an important part of it. And that brands will then connect into that, maybe through a more kind of just a lightweight suite of the product, something less technical or something more kind of specific to their job. And then there's also an enormous opportunity for these, let's just call them like middle companies, as you say, to these almost like agents, or where again, there's not to say that they have no value whatsoever. Of course, middle companies in that way are I think being challenged very often for many reasons. But I think that a lot of these companies have an opportunity to add a lot more value with DPC, and I think that they also kind of fall a bit more in under the supplier-led DPC model, that we could almost like consider that both garment manufacturers and service providers that are connected or integrated into production should consider this.
And I think what we've kind of also talked about today is this is also replicating the existing workflow in DPC, right?
Yeah.
This is apart from, I would say, the change to this collaborative digital workspace, as opposed to when you would all go and sit around a table with one piece in front of you, one fashion piece in front of you, and say, right, we want this shoulder to be like this, we want the pattern to be like this. That's kind of what we used to do,
Yeah.
prior to
Yeah.
just sending out all of the design ideas. So there are also going to be other models that exist where you're not replicating the current workflow. And maybe
Yeah.
that's another episode, because I think we're coming to time.
Yes. Yeah. No, but I think we should end on a positive note also with this, that while we acknowledge the difficulties around this, and while I think the definition of what supplier-led model actually means is an ongoing discussion, when maybe we can summarize a little bit also what we intend, why did we bring up this, and what were our intentions? Our intentions are essentially to look at, coming back to where we started the episode, of looking at, we are at a bit of a low point of DPC right now, where it's getting less attention than it has over the last few years. And this seems to be a bit of an opportunity for us to maybe shift things around and maybe think about it differently. And here's where we're proposing, it's a theory at the moment. Right now, we're going to have to, I think that there are a lot of garment manufacturers that are doing a lot of the things we've talked about. And I could name many of them, but I'm not going to do that here. But companies that I think are doing really good right now with leading DPC from the garment manufacturer side. There are companies that are really good with this. And I think it would be interesting actually to hear from more of those companies and specifically dive into this. But in the end of the day, we're looking to almost trying to at least almost make us think about the time that we're in right now as an opportunity to rethink DPC, and for garment vendors and potentially even this service companies integrated with production could pick up DPC where it is right now and can restructure and rethink it a little bit of where these investments could be made. And maybe even in particular, if a garment factory has the motivation and the skills and the financial abilities to do this, which is probably going to be a group of its own of garment manufacturers that can do this, this is an opportunity to invest in this right now. And it's going to most likely be a longer term investment. You have to think of it as not just something that you install Clo and then tomorrow you've made back the entire investment. It's going to be a longer term investment that will most likely pay itself back in the collaboration that you'll have with the brands, the reduction in samples and the cost of making those samples, and in the resources utilized and all this. So we have to find a way to measure almost the impact on business and on the environment with this, but that's what we're proposing.
And also the cleaner communication of design ideas and information, right? Not the back and forth that we currently have to sort of live with. So yeah, I completely agree with what you said. I also, as DPC has developed over the last 4 years, really exponentially, what we also have available to us is bucket loads of libraries of digital assets out there, right?
Exactly.
You've got YKK, you've got chargeurs for the interlining suppliers. You've got multitudes of different fabric libraries which you can tap into, or start to build your own digital fabric libraries. You've got WGSN that are doing 3D versions of what they used to do flat versions of. You've got Cottonworks. So you've got Clo Connect, right, which is a huge resource for loads of people. And you've got a multitude of 3D designers out there kind of ready to work on these assets. So if you were doing this maybe 5 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to pick up a zip here, a button there, a trim there. It's getting easier by the day, and I think that's what we have to keep on saying. As these libraries are being built, it's getting easier by the day to start a foundation of digital product creation. And I would encourage suppliers to start looking at it like that as well, and encourage their design. If you're going to do DPC internally, encourage your 3D designers to be pulling those assets from other areas. You are not creating them all by yourself. Would take far too much time. So it's just making sure that they understand that that level of digital asset collaboration that's already out there and ready to be tapped into. So Yeah.
One of the good things
That's
about digital is that you can copy paste it as many times as you want. It doesn't necessarily
exactly.
need as
Should we
much
do
resources. Yeah.
should we do an episode about ownership next? That would be
Yes, I think
great.
that's very important to talk about. But of course, the big benefit is having something digital that you can just replicate as many times as you want. And of course, there's
Exactly.
technologies like blockchain and NFT and digital ownership and
Yeah.
just IP law in general. I think we have to talk about. But that's a very interesting potential episode for the future. But I think you summarized it really well, and I think maybe we just we leave it at that for now. Or would you like to add anything more, Gabby, before
No,
we
no,
close it up?
we're closing. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who managed to listen for the 49 minutes. We did say it was going to be
Yes.
a deep dive. When we come
Mm,
back with our next episode, we're going to keep it under that 20 minutes for
yes.
sure for you all. But we thought this is a really interesting time as well to kind of deep dive
Yeah.
into this space. So we'd like to
Yeah.
say, yeah, thank you for listening and see
Oh,
you next time. Yeah.
see you next time. Yeah. All right.
Thank you for listening to The Seamless Blend. If you enjoyed today's discussion, feel free to subscribe. We also invite you to connect with us and participate in our discussions on Discord. Let us know if you agree, disagree, or have any questions. Until next time, take care.